Good evening, good morning to the people who are attending this lecture. This is our first lecture of the series for this year, and it will be given by Professor Balaji Parthasarthi from IIITB. I think the topic is very relevant today, given the kind of technological insertion that is taking place all over the world. So the title of his talk is Thinking Institutionally About Technology Design for Social Inclusion. Balaji is a professor at IIIT Bangalore and a co-founder for Institute Center for Information Technology and Public Policies. His interests are rooted in economic geography, economic sociology, explore the relationship between technological change, innovation, economic globalization, and social transformation, especially in underprivileged contexts. His research and publications span the organization of production of global software industry to the political economy of e-governance, e-waste, and social innovation. His current work examines the opportunities and constraints afforded by the digital platform economy. I can tell you a little bit more about him, but I think I'll give the mic to him so that he can get started with the lecture.
Okay. Thank you, Sab, for the invitation, and to the CRI community for inviting me to share some of my ideas on an issue that I've sort of long been thinking about. And this work actually comes from a book that I co-authored with my good friend and colleague, Yuko Awayama, a professor at Clark University in the US. Okay, so let me start this presentation by sharing the sort of work of, or talking about three people whose work I've long admired in different fields and domains, but nevertheless, in 2018, all three of them received what is arguably the highest awards or accolades in their respective fields. To my left is Balkrishna Doshi, the late architect from Ahmedabad, who in 2018 was awarded the Pritzker Prize, which is by far the sort of the highest recognition that one can get in the field of sort of architecture and design for his contributions to contemporary architecture. In the middle, the lady is Aruna Sairam, who in that very year was named the Sangeeta Kalanidhi by the Madras Music Academy, which is the sort of the highest distinction that one gets in the field of classical music, a lady whose music I much admire. And to my right is Paul Romer, the economist who in 2018 won the Nobel Prize for his contributions to endogenous growth theory and for sort of providing insights into how innovation and technological change are very crucial for long-run economic growth. Now, I would call these people designers by drawing on the definition from the Cambridge Dictionary, you know, where you take it as a verb, where you talk about, you know, design as something where you make or draw plans for something, or it represents a certain intentionality. Or as a noun, which refers to the way in which something is planned and made, or a pattern, right? Now, the question is, you know, how do these individuals we admire and decorate achieve what it is that they do in their respective fields, right? We sort of decorate them as individuals, right? But beyond that, are there ways and means to encourage the emergence of such individuals, besides relying on notions of sort of innate creativity, genius, or talent, right? Now, the argument that this presentation will make is that increasingly, you know, solving complex challenges to ensure that social groups are not excluded from the benefits that others enjoy cannot be left to individuals alone. There's a need for alternate social arrangements, which I will later describe as the hybrid domain, to generate what has been referred to as satisficing design. This goes back, of course, to the work of Herb Simon. So in a sense, while we may continue to decorate and sort of recognize these individuals for their contributions, their genius, whatever it is that you might call it, that having just a bunch of these individuals is not going to help us address many of our pressing problems. There's a need for institutions, to define which I draw on the work of another Nobel laureate, Douglas North, which are humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interactions. They could be formal constitutions, laws, and property rights, or informal ones, sanctions, taboos, customs, traditions, or codes of conduct. Now, when we think about institutions, right, they evolved because of a desire to sort of minimize uncertainty and solidarity in social interaction. And this kind of sort of need for institutions and teamwork goes back to, the 18th and 19th centuries, where the work of people like Adam Smith or Emily Durkheim pointed to how there is an increasingly fine-grained division of labor, and how that which comes about to provide sort of economic efficiency and social solidarity as societies industrialize. Now, if you look back from the late 19th century onwards, the two sort of the dominant institutions have been the state and the market in the public and the private domains. And this sort of dichotomous state market-led development models have undoubtedly delivered sort of, very sort of almost historically unprecedented prosperity, right? And in fact, the UC Berkeley economist Bradley Long recently came out of the book where he said slouching towards prosperity in the 20th century. But yet, sort of, while this dichotomous model has delivered phenomenal sort of prosperity in the aggregate, the 20th century's institutional models sort of limitations are evident in the inability to ensure that the prosperity is widely shared. So you have a huge, a whole lot of people, a majority that gets excluded from the remarkable changes that we witnessed in the past 150 years. Now, part of the reason is, of course, state failure in poor countries, and its retreat in advanced countries, thanks to this sort of the ideological advance of what you might call neoliberalism. And these have contributed to and sort of reinforced growing inequality. Similarly, while you have markets which are very good at allocative efficiency, there have been, corporate scandals, bribery, and so on and so forth that have rendered the private sector increasingly suspect. And while, for example, economic sociologists have talked to the importance of embeddedness between state and capital for economic transformation, when they go to bed with one another, then it sort of ends up leading to a variety of these scandals and a growing disenchantment with private capital in particular, and the state also. Now, the rising inequities are evident in sort of various forms, particularly in terms of access to physical and social infrastructure. And you have these sort of acute crises, financial crises, environmental crises, and the rise of what the sociologist Manuel Castells calls of a fourth world, in addition to the traditional sort of 1, 2, 3, first, second, third world distinctions. Now, this is just a sort of a simple diagram, which I'm sure everybody in this on this conversation knows about, to sort of conceptualize the state market distinction by looking at the difference between public and private goods. You have excludability and non-excludability on one axis, rivalness and non-rivalness on the other. Now, conventionally, sort of in economics, this is how we look at it, although we have come to recognize that none of this is set in stone. For instance, you have the horizontal line, the dotted line, which is property rights, which can shift back and forth. And in fact, in recent years, the growing emphasis under the sort of what you might call the neoliberal regime, where property rights have been significantly, there's been a great emphasis on property rights, the line has sort of moved upwards. And you can see this greater excludability of a variety of goods. So for instance, when we used to take public goods for granted, you now have toll roads and so on and so forth, which actually leave out certain segments of the population. And what we also know is on the vertical axis, the dotted line, the vertical dotted line, you see technology, and then we also witness technological changes that have led to the shifting boundaries between rival and non-rival goods. So, for instance, you now have a lot of things that we were thought were rival, for instance, newspapers, etc., which you can get online. However, while this boundary has shifted, there are many things that are digital, where the marginal costs of production are little to nothing. We have also come to recognize, for instance, the work of Kentaro Toyama at the University of Michigan has pointed out that technology only amplifies capabilities. It's not the sort of the magic wand that it was once imagined to be, that it's going to sort of solve many of our problems. But nevertheless, what you're going to, or what as Kentaro points out, is that it only sort of more sharply brings into focus the differences in access and differences in privileges across society. All right. Now, but what this sort of is it just provides sort of a useful starting point, this distinction. And what we do know is that states are necessary to sort of innovate and supply certain forms of public goods where returns for the private sector are hard to recoup. For instance, in India, we wouldn't be talking about a Chandrayaan if we didn't have ISRO and the space program, which is almost entirely funded by the state, right? And markets, of course, are an ideal option to innovate, supply goods and services with this clear pricing and an ability to exclude those who cannot pay, etc. And here, the poster child of India in the last 2 to 3 decades, the Indian software services industry and its global delivery model is a great case in point. However, when states fail, if at all sort of firms end up addressing markets for the less affluent, they typically resort to either selling obsolete products or they de-feature existing products in their portfolio. And furthermore, what happens is that states and firms are typically reliant on top-down models of innovation, and even sort of de-featuring or selling obsolete products often sort of does not guarantee any demand, because the critical thing is that they're often based on alien design assumptions, and that's very critical here to sort of for this presentation. Now, there's another sort of an aspect, or which sort of another concept or aspect which sort of points to the sort of the limits of the state market dichotomy, right? And this comes with the idea of sort of what are called global public goods, right? A good is globally public when it's both non-rival and non-excludable, and its benefits impact more than one group of countries and does not discriminate against any population group or generation. Okay? But global public goods are problematic, right? Unclear who governs their production and delivery, since the provision and consumption of public goods are not conceptualized as being tradable across national borders. In other words, the whole concept of public goods is based on very clearly defined jurisdictions. States typically tax citizens, and then that in turn pays for some of these public goods and services. Now, the provision of global public goods is not possible by rescaling of public goods because it challenges the concept of non-excludability, right? And as geographical distance and national regulatory boundaries shape accessibility to the site of public goods provision, access is not going to be uniformly distributed across the globe, right? So that's sort of, there's what you might call distance decay. And in terms of global public goods and providing sort of solutions for them, this whole debates around climate change, rising sea levels, etc., are instances. Now these sort of limitations of this state market dichotomy has resulted in our inability to tackle challenges that we describe as wicked. That is, those that are ill-formulated, where the information is confusing, where there are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values. Goes back to the classic work of Churchman in the 1960s. And these problems, as Rittel and Weber pointed out, are not amenable to what you might call quote unquote scientific solutions because of multiple interdependencies. Now, it's in acknowledging these sort of wicked problems that there's been a shift in expectations of development from mere economic growth to be more encompassing in the form of the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. And okay, now we realize that we have these gaps. So what is it that we've actually done about it, right? So starting from the 1980s, with the so-called Washington Consensus and the ascendance of sort of neoliberalism, there were efforts to bridge this sort of state market gap by what was called, by this movement to sort of reinvent governments. And this typically referred to public-private partnerships where certain public sector obligations are met by the private sector, with shared objectives for public service infrastructure delivery, right? But the problem is for wicked problems, but the issue is that for wicked problems, clear goals and shared objectives are far from easy, right? And this sort of a situation, what we've been seeing is also a third sector, right? Mostly, the voluntary sector or the NGOs have also sort of long existed to fill development gaps. But the thing is that states and markets have typically viewed them as adversaries, right? Why? Because NGOs typically hold the state to account for development failures, and they also end up targeting the practices of firms, right? So they might point to the inability of firms or firms not adhering to certain labor standards, for instance, and so on and so forth, and also pulling up governments for not delivering a variety of public services. But for firms, NGOs, for example, are seen as little more than tree huggers or do-gooders with no understanding of the real world. So in that sense, there's this sort of long been this adversarial relationship between states, markets, and NGOs. Now, but there's a big, but what makes the sort of the voluntaries or the NGO sector interesting is that they often meet a variety of citizen needs, especially given state failure, with bottom-up design. But which sets them apart. But this approach is not without its difficulties, right? So for instance, you had the appropriate technologies movement back from the 1960s and 1970s, but that also sort of suffered from, a variety of problems: limited transferability, weak institutional support, insufficient funding, along with the perception of technological inferiority. So you have so many examples of smokeless chulas and all kinds of things, but in terms of actually making a significant impact, or at least their impact has been limited. And of course, then you also the more recent celebration of Jugaad for ingenuity in meeting needs in conditions of scarcity. But even the sort of the diffusion of Jugaad-based innovations have suffered from high transactions costs for scouting and documentation. How do you know something that works in one location will work elsewhere? And there's also been the need for value addition. There's been the need for finance, problems with property rights, and so on and so forth, that make them very local solutions, but are not necessarily able to travel beyond a certain point. Of course, just like you have Jugaad in India, you have other forms of grassroots improvisation. For example, in China, you have something called Shanzhai, which is really associated, a lot of it is associated with IP violation and counterfeiting. And then you have Jaito in Brazil, which is essentially means of bypassing state regulation. So you have these sort of alternate approaches to design. So but as sort of what you're seeing is that new sort of approaches sort of starting to emerge, because as development priorities shift, and as I mentioned earlier, the MDGs, the SDGs, and so on, and with this sort of a growing emphasis on what people are referred to as the triple bottom line: financial, the social, and the environmental. The rise of things like ethical investing, the demographic flattening in affluent countries, there's been a sort of this really urgent need to pursue new design approaches. One approach has been to abandon formal closed structure approaches in favor of what Henry Chesbrough calls open innovation, to mobilize external assets from partners, so that it's not one organization or one, or an individual who's able to do anything and everything, right? But effective open innovation really requires an environment characterized by the strong presence of external sources of ideas. It could be universities, venture capital, other startups, and also a high degree of labor mobility, so that you're able to draw on what Annalise Saxenian describes as a technical community, right? But these might not. The problem is that these might not exist everywhere. Now, in emerging economies and poorer countries where weak institutional and IP regimes pose difficulties in implementing the open innovation model, the other sort of alternative, which emerged from the work of C.K. Prahalad, of course, is to pursue the so-called fortune at the bottom of the pyramid with notions of frugal innovation. But while that generated a lot of sort of excitement and interest, I mean, the thing is that our own work, because this work actually comes out of a book that I wrote with Yoko Awayama. The book was published in 2017. It was very clear that the fortune at the so-called bottom of the pyramid has been rather hard to find. That's because, the seekers of these fortunes assume that the absence of products and services for the poor is exclusively a question of affordability. So, if only they had more money, they could buy your iPhones and, all the other fancy gadgets that better off people might possess. But the problem is that that's not the only thing. There are also issues of, the BOP being found in locations where there is, reliable infrastructure. It's hard to find, whether it's power or, roads, et cetera, et cetera. And possibly the most important problem has been to treat the BOP as something that is socially and culturally homogeneous, right? And which is clearly not the case. And also overlooking the fact that many of them might have limited skills and that there are low literacy levels. And also there's a whole question of lack of prior exposure to technology for many segments of the BOP, if not everybody in the BOP. Now, okay, so if you're going to attack or sort of address the needs of the BOP, there is the answer was supposed to be, frugal innovation. Of course, an idea that actually can be traced to the ideas of Carlos Ghosn, Carlos Ghosn, the former chairman, or might I also say the now disgraced chairman of Renault Nissan. So the thing is that, the whole idea of frugal innovation also turned out to be non-trivial, because it's not just about cost cutting. Frugal products must be easy to use, robust, use raw materials sparingly, and be sensitive to environmental impact. Now, but the problem is also how innovation itself was conceptualized, right? Innovation, for the most part, at least until recently, was mostly understood as a technology-driven process, right? Based on, scientific knowledge, if you will, measured often by supply-side factor inputs, such as the size of the technical labor force, or by outcomes such as, patents per, per unit spending, and so on. The incorporation of demand or user-side knowledge into innovation and product development into the process was actually fairly under-theorized. It's now we are only starting to recognize that. And a challenge for frugal innovation has really been the lack of lead users and markets to provide the stimuli for products and processes that a firm typically needs, right? And the thing is that if you want to satisfy the BOP, you can't actually go to the BOP to suddenly start playing the role of a lead user or to provide you with lead users, because a large segment of this population has had no prior exposure to the kind of technologies or even variants of the technology that you'd like them to have, right? So there has been this sort of problem even in terms, or there's been significant problems, not just on the supply side, but also on the demand side. And it's sort of, if it is sort of easy to sort of understand the sort of BOP and achieve frugality, it's in this context that the whole notion of social innovation is increasingly being pursued. And, this has also been talked about in the past. And the work of Peter Drucker, who conceptualized social innovation as institutional design that generates social benefits, and sort of the title of this talk harks back to that in part. While there's another definition that that sort of talks about social innovation as the creation of new products, services, organizational activities that are better or more effective than traditional public sector, philanthropic, or market-reliant approaches in responding to social exclusion. And this starts to provide certain insights. I'll get to that. Now, social innovation actually relies on new technologies, especially ICTs, to create new business models and micro modes of delivery to resolve issues of socio-spatial accessibility and start to challenge so-called last mile problems. However, it's important to sort of emphasize here that technology is useful, but it's far from sufficient. So let's sort of take a step into that further, right? To sort of pursue social innovation, it's interesting how firms over the last 2 decades have increasingly turned to partner NGOs. And why is this? Because like I said, they're historically quite sort of antagonistic and adversarial. But what NGOs offer are grassroots linkages that permit the design of goods and services, and they are also sort of able to bring to the table a certain amount of community participation, right? So NGOs provide what you might call last mile connectivity to lead users in local markets and offer, what geographers call, spatially sticky tacit knowledge that firms find hard to obtain on their own. In other words, for instance, you have all these, particularly in India, you have labs of large firms, plenty of talent, companies have plenty of technology, money, etc. But that ability to obtain tacit knowledge, and how is it that users who had no prior or little exposure to technology would actually perceive them, how to sort of ask the right questions about what their needs are, is something that eludes many of these researchers. So there is the importance of NGOs, especially in a place like India, is likely to increase with the mandating of the corporate social responsibility following the passage of the Companies Act of 2013, where companies making a certain amount of profit have to set aside a segment of that profit towards predefined or well-defined corporate social responsibility activities, right? Now, what's interesting is that we've observed that working together between things like between groups of NGOs and companies and so on has also resulted in what sociologists call institutional isomorphism, right? Where NGOs start to adopt the processes and structures of firms to demonstrate their accountability to users, because that's been a serious challenge, right? About, okay, is it just that you want the money, and then how are you going to be accountable for it? And firms have also started to make changes in the way they actually conduct themselves, because not only is it that they are open now to the idea of working with NGOs, and that many large firms who have labs, including the Microsofts and the Googles of the world, are all doing that. But they also started to change to say, look, this is not just about throwing money or throwing technology, but it's actually coming to appreciate the domains in which you are going to have to bring about change. So in the sense that there must be some side of an insight that must actually be developed into what it is that you're going to throw your technology or money at, to even determine the value of it. So what happens is you start to see this blurring of institutional missions. So while firms bring technologies and skills, NGOs bring knowledge of local communities and users, while the state remains a crucial partner as it allows services in areas such as health and education to scale. Because even if an NGO and a large company, a multinational, want to work together, if you want 5,000 schools where you want to roll out an education program, it's only the state that can provide you access to that kind of social infrastructure. So this blurring of distinction between the public and private domains, where the public interest may well be represented by non-government entities, such as NGOs, or even by market actors, by, for example, renewable energy providers, right? Now, where the blurring happens is what I'm referring to as the hybrid domain, which provides a necessary sort of an institutional framework to provide social innovation by combining social and economic missions, because that's what this really represents. combining these missions where you have companies, the state, and the NGOs or the voluntary sector coming together to meet certain social goals. There are issues with it, but we can talk about it during the Q&A. Now, this is what it's sort of. This is from a school outside Bangalore, and I take this photo. And if you look at this photograph closely, you'll see a list of donors, right? So you'll see names like Dell and ITC and 3M, some very, very well-known names on this, right? So this is a list of people who've donated, the philanthropy has benefited school. But look at this board on the next slide, right? And this is at a different school where it says, look, you have Intel Foundation, Intel Bangalore, but then you also have Department of Education, Government of Karnataka, you have the Tamil Nadu government, Asha Foundation, okay, Jakkur Village Community, and so on. So what this represents is you have the coming together of people or, representing all three sectors, the state, the voluntary sector, and the private sector. Whereas in the previous slide, all the donors have come only from the private sector, right? This is historically the approach to solving problems. It's very top down. I give you the resources. After that, I don't care. In a way, I sort of, met certain obligations of mine. But this actually is the coming together. This represents the coming together of different sectors, the private sector, the public sector, and the voluntary sector, each bringing to the table its own strengths to address some of these wicked problems. Now, the hybrid domain, to get a little more into sort of detail, is distinguished by bottom-up characteristics, where stakeholders, initially uncoordinated and disparate, gradually articulate a pragmatic, solution-oriented agenda in hybrid mission to generate designs for wicked problems, right? Now, it is interesting. So I'm often asked, so what happens if they come up with these solutions? What happens, who owns the IP? My answer to that question is when you don't even have P, there's no question of IP. In other words, you must actually define the problem, generate some kind of property, then start worrying about, who gets to keep the IP and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of pragmatism that necessitates hybrid governance. And this pragmatism or this hybrid governance involves interactions between two axes of transformation, right? One, newly sort of emerging hybrid norms that combine an economic social missions require what I call domain flexibility. In other words, the division of labor between public, private, civil society, and hybrid organizations. So that's the domain flexibility. And secondly, a geographical rescaling from the subnational to the global. So because the scale of governance demands what I call scalar flexibility. And, because some of these problems, not all, require approaches to governance where, a state-centered approach is increasingly obsolete. And there's plenty of evidence of where you've had state failures. So this is what this the relationship. You have this the hybrid domain, which comes from this governance gap, a double failure. This sort of draws on the work of Karl Polanyi. You have state failure, market failure. And you can think about it as a sort of pushback on that. And you have new organizational arrangement, which provides both domain flexibility, that is cross-domain collaborations and hybrid organizations. You have scalar flexibility, where you have, which is being supported by global venture philanthropy, for instance, transnational social entrepreneurships, which in turn is leading to social innovation, new designs for social impacts, application of new technologies. And let me sort of provide a couple of examples of how this plays out from fieldwork that we've undertaken. One is a cross-domain effort to fight TB, right, and which is a widely prevalent problem in India. So the conventional approach is through the WHO dots, which is like WHO, which is the direct observed treatment short course, and that's a fairly well-defined treatment, right? But the thing is, the problem is it's not just the treatment. While the treatment may be well-defined, the prevalence of TB is more a social issue. It tends to afflict the poor, and daily wage labor often cannot take medicines regularly. And the nature of TB gives patients a certain social stigma, right? About, so-and-so being a TB patient. And people are sometimes reluctant to it or loath to admit it. So this NGO started in 2006 with the goal of eradicating TB, initially in the slums of Delhi, and to take free government-issued medicines to residents. So what they did was to hire community workers locally to inconspicuously give medicines from routinely frequented spots such as a grocery store or a temple and things like that. And workers also visited families to counsel them on the spreading of infection. Okay, so. But the NGO then also partnered with a large multinational company and their R&D center to design an Android tablet-based low-cost sort of biometric system with fingerprint reader to register new patients and to record every dose that was taken. Now, the tablet was connected to a server which highlights missed dosages to the community worker and program managers and forcing sort of immediate and prompt follow-up. And so what this did was to sharply cut dropout rates from about 30% to about 3%, because that is a key problem. Because it's even if the medicines reach the beneficiaries or the TB patients, often because many of them are sort of in construction work and where they have to move from site to site and so on, they end up missing their doses, and that in turn exacerbates the problem. Now, the NGO actually, which started off then, and when I say now, the date goes back to about 2018, covered more than 9 million patients across 4,000 villages and urban slums in India and in Cambodia. And it was also expanding to Africa, won a number of awards, including the Schwab Foundation's 2014 Social Entrepreneur of the Year. Now, what this is about really an instance of domain flexibility of a social problem where the state provided a quasi-public good, in this case, the medicines, the private sector, a certain technology, with the last mile delivery provided by the NGO. Now, we'll take another example on which illustrates a scalar flexibility. And this has to do with vaccine supplies. Now, weak infrastructure or rural supply chains hurt the poor the hardest, especially for access to time-sensitive products such as vaccines. To sort of attack this problem, you had an American of Indian origin, elite private university education, some very big name universities, came back to India after a lot of experience in building robust supply chains, including for the US Army. And the US Army requirements of network architecture and redundancies, he told me later, were very similar to the rural requirements in India. And he helped build a TSC, is a transnational social enterprise. He built an open source cloud-based logistics MIS, which allowed network agnostic feature phones to collect and receive last mile data, right? So these are all feature phones, not smartphones, by the way. So the data included information dashboards, data analytics for inventory management, etc., monitoring of storage conditions, and so on. Now, in 2008, with a grant from the Deshpande Foundation, we just heard somebody mentioning the Deshpande Foundation earlier. The product idea was tested at MIT's, Innovations in International Health Lab, and there was a survey in Karnataka, 150 villages, and the NGO sort of deployed it. First started to manage about 29 public health centers for the government of Karnataka in a fairly remote area in the Tamil Nadu border. So what the impact was, you saw stock availability, that is immunization days when vaccines are available, for 9 vaccines rise to 99%. And this used to be a problem, a serious problem earlier. And stock replacement times fell from 14 days to 5 days per vaccine, which reflected behavioral changes among pharmacists who were able to provide, when they were provided with better feedback. See, a big problem with this was they didn't know when to place the orders. They weren't sure when they'd get the orders. Vaccines, of course, deteriorated with time, and eventually the patients at these rural health centers were the ones who suffered. Now, this organization, there's a typo there, sorry, supports, I think it's more than 500 million vaccines annually in India, and it operates across other countries, including Congo, South Sudan, Zambia, reflecting a successful combination of transnational resources for local needs, which is why I refer to this as a case of scalar flexibility, right? You're able to sort of scale globally using a set of resources and knowledge that is gained in particular locations. Okay, let me have this. Let me get to this concluding slide, and then we can have a Q&A. So the hybrid domain has been conceptualized to overcome wicked problems of inclusive development, especially for the BOP population. Now we can talk and quibble about the validity of the BOP classification, but nevertheless the target here is those who are historically been excluded and vulnerable to exclusion. So achieving frugal innovation has been hard, for many reasons, including circumstances and diversity of the BOP population, increasingly obsolete institutional means which tend to pit states versus markets, fuzziness in the public good, private good distinction, and because NGOs also offer limited alternatives. Because historically, except for a handful, NGOs, while they might have good local knowledge, have lacked access to technology or access to financial resources, and that has been a limitation. Okay, now this impasse has been overcome, or is being overcome, with emergent institutional approaches that lead to the blending of organizational logics and missions, which is domain flexibility, and by combining resources, that is capital, skills, and technologies with local knowledge. This is what scalar flexibility is about. Now, domain flexibility and scalar flexibility actually reinforce one another. In the TB case, the domain flexibility led to the scalar flexibility in the sense that that NGO has now gone well beyond India to Cambodia and places like that. In the supply chain case, it was the other way around. It was knowledge that was gathered from various socio-spatial scales that was brought to bear on to address the problems of this tribal community in Karnataka. And of course, then those ideas were picked up and were taken back again to other parts of the world. So that's my presentation. I'll be very happy to take questions and to hopefully we can have a engaging discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Balaji, and I'll open the floor for questions. Anybody to start, Shyam or Sudhir?
Yeah, so one question I have, Balaji, is when you look at supporting innovations from a public goods or a private goods, there is already some institutional mechanisms through which it can happen. Now, in this particular case, is it the formation of that local networking which then goes and looks for this support, or is there a separate new kind of institutional arrangement required to identify and support these kind of initiatives?
I mean, let me answer that based on how I understand your question. If I'm understanding it wrong, please correct me. See,
okay, let me clarify. Let me clarify. Is here it is like a network forming between a set of entities, right, which is driven by a very specific requirement. Now, after the network forms is where the resources required which needs to come. Is that the way it is going to happen, or is there an agency actively going to look for creation of these networks?
No, I don't think it. See, it is about, as they say in open source software, right? You do it to scratch an itch because you see these as compelling problems, right? And then you have people who are already working on this. For example, you might have a company that's interested in solving this particular issue. You have states that are unable to solve this issue. You might have NGOs who are working on this problem already by addressing the needs. So when they come together using a set of resources, they might be monetary, non-monetary, technological, non-technological. Then, I mean, this has to be, you don't have necessarily see this as this network forming to then sort of consciously pursue this challenge. You see this network forming as a consequence of this challenge that is existed and which has defied easy solutions, because if it did have easy solutions or answers, either the NGO could have done it, the state could have done it, or the private sector could have done it independently. It is because that they're unable to do it on their own, they actually have to come together to address the challenge. I don't know if I've answered your question.
So it is going to be need-based, and it may happen in different contexts, may not happen. It is
exactly.
Going to be like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, I think what's critical here is this historic antagonism between state, market, and voluntary sectors are slowly coming down, precisely because they realize each of them has different strengths and they have problems that none of them can solve on their
own. Thank you, Balaji, for an excellent topic and talk. And this is Shyam Sundar, and I have a couple of questions. One is, when you get multiple organizations involved in a project, it brings the advantages that you rightly pointed out. It also increases the additional resource demand of people and time needed to coordinate among these different organizations, especially organizations from different domains. Mm-hmm. So I suspect the reluctance to go across organizations and different types of organizations may have its roots in the economy of those, the resource economy related to the coordination effort. Yeah. And because they may have very different cultures and goals, and just getting them to work together and coordinate and focus on the same issue can be a major challenge for people coming from different sectors of the economy.
No, I agree with you, Professor Shyam Sundar. This is not to suggest that this is frictionless at all, because like you said, they have different goals, a profit maximizing organization, welfare maximizing organizations, and so on and so forth. You do have significant transactions costs as a consequence. So it doesn't always work, it doesn't always succeed. And in the places where this has worked, all parties have said there have been, it's taken multiple iterations to actually get them to, and that's also, and over a period of time, in some instances, there has evolved what I refer to as institutional isomorphism. So, if I'm going to take money from you, I'm going to have to put in place certain accountability measures. And if you're going to give it to me, don't give me your technology or your money just to make sure as another marketing tool, right? So that things should not be done. So and so on. So the thing is, there is this sort of boundaries that have to be crossed, but the larger incentive here is that I can't do it on my own. And for companies, they lack the tacit knowledge, particularly despite money and technology. NGOs lack the technology and the financial resources, despite having the tacit knowledge. For states, although they have the scale, they're not able to roll out some of these solutions with great ease. And for companies, there has been this great incentive saying, oh, there is this, unmet markets. You're having, when you're having demographic flattening or decline in your own home markets, they're sort of salivating at the prospect of beating, billion customers, 2 billion customers, numbers are trotted out routinely. But sadly, many of them realize that they don't have the wherewithal to get to, quote unquote, the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And Sab, if I may, could I mention another issue which is somewhat off the topic?
Can you push your screen up? We see only half of your face.
Okay. Well, okay. I was trying to get you to see only half my face. Okay. So I think you mentioned about IP. Mm-hmm. And over the last 10 or 20 years, I have come to have second thoughts about the IP regime that we now live under, WTO. And especially in these domains that you're talking about, I think there should be an IP exception where there is no IP, basically, that anything that anybody devises is free for availability for all. Though I have serious doubts about, even in medicine and other fields, whether the current IP regime has done any good for the world. And if you go back to the older regime 30, 40 years ago, we'll probably be better off. But at least in this domain, IP makes no sense to me, but let me stop here.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Shyam Sundar, I think that's something that I agree with you, and probably many people will agree with you. But nevertheless, even if you say that IP is going to play a major role, because companies are not going to give up their claims, the problem, like I mentioned earlier, is when you don't have a P, You don't even have property. What are you going to protect? Because you don't know how to serve these large markets. This hybrid domain comes about to generate the P. To talk about IP before that is to put the cart before the horse.
Yes.
So that's the thing. So that's a different normative debate as to whether we should have IP or not. But now we don't even have a P. That's my only contention.
Okay.
I think Harsha had raised his hand earlier.
Yeah, go ahead, Harsha.
Hello, Professor Balaji. I just wanted to ask you from the supply side a bit. So there has been a lot of discussion around the whole frugal innovation, and I completely agree with you that it only works up to a certain point, but it's not like enough to sort of really boost, or it's not a substitute for real research. And I'll come back to what I mean by real research. What I would like to know is that when you're talking about things like innovation or research, we are only talking about logistics of delivery or logistics of services, etc. But what if you want to actually develop the next vaccine rather than how do you deliver the vaccine? So I see that the UK did this using a purely publicly funded organization to develop the COVID vaccine that we were able to use because it was not IP protected. And even if you want no IP, it's better if the state sort of invests in these things. But having said that, my question to you was that in India, the current regime is completely anti-scientific. And right now there has been a proposal to change the institutional structure for research funding, which is much more centralized and is asking the private sector to fund the scientific research. Do you think this is on the lines of what you have presented? Do you think this presents us with a proper level playing field for all institutions that are engaging in research/innovation? The second thing is, like, do you think that it is because you just mentioned that private sectors are better at distribution efficiency? That's
allocative.
Allocative efficiency, yes. So that I agree. But then the problem is, if the company doesn't see any value, for example, in India, no IT company wants to invest in development of a vaccine. So do you think that the prioritization of what research happens, shouldn't that be much more from state, because it is democratically elected? It should be directed from the state, and the state should fund certain sorts of research on their own in order to create real innovation, because ISRO was funded by the state, and whether there is an IP or not, nobody was willing to take the risk of funding something like ISRO's works other than the state. Of course, now you can license it, but I'm just worried that aren't we selling ourselves as a innovation group? So that's it. I'm done. Sorry about the long question.
Yeah, look, I think that the thing is there are a couple of issues here. One is the need for science and technology, research in fundamental science and technology, that clearly the state has to keep funding. But when we talk about innovation, if you look at the distinction between technological change and innovation, innovation is the appropriation of these technologies in order to sort of insert into daily life, right? So even if you talk about a supply chain or a logistics transformation, that is definitely an innovation, right? To the extent that that actually contributes to the enhancing of somebody's quality of life, very broadly defined, why not? So the thing is, we also should not fall victim to technological fetishism, right? So it's about, you don't necessarily have to invent the latest all the time, but it's also about figuring out how to insert it in new organizational frameworks into, so that, so for example, what if you go back to the Smithian notion of, go over to Adam Smith, there's a division of labor, you can have the technical division of labor. So science and technology research can point to new technical divisions of labor, but you also have new social divisions of labor, new skills, new forms of organization, right? Your startups and so on coming up. And then you also have spatial divisions of labor. You can do it from different locations. The Indian software industry is a case in point, even though none of their technology is like rocket science. So I think we should not be sort of caught up in this whole notion of what is it that, are we at the, quote unquote, the bleeding edge of technology? If, for example, you can provide those vaccines in a mass scale, which is what the Serum Institute was able to do in a way that like no other part of the world is able to. Hey, if that's not innovating in a certain manner, why is that a problem, right? So I think fundamentally we have to ask, technology change, innovation for what purpose and for whom? Very important question. Which segment of society are you actually talking about? The guy on the street who's barely has access to water is not going to be worried about whether it's coming through some fabulous reverse osmosis technology, or you're just filtering some water at the street corner and giving it to him.
Okay, Harsha, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Could you address the institutional structure? Because the second part of it was, do you think going centralization, the way India is trying to privatize versus like the NSF model in the US, where they state that the customer has to be this person, because you are funding it, you can say that this is for the end user.
Yeah, see, unfortunately, there is no right or wrong answer on this in this kind of thing, right? So the thing is, it's even if you take ISRO, now they're trying to sort of get the private sector involved, and I don't see anything wrong with that. There is significant capability where the government does not have to invest, where you can actually tap into the capabilities that are existing around you. Why treat them as black sheep, right? At the same time, the government has to actually decide there are certain areas where we're going to take the lead, because you don't see, for either there's the problems of, recovery of costs and so on and so forth, where the government has to go ahead and invest. So there is to be able to see these or to view these in black and white terms, I think is highly problematic. It's about, you have to understand the nature of the challenge, right?
And
which segments of that challenge are, require certain kinds of centralized state funding, and which segments can be best left to, I mean, why do you want, a passport office now is sort of, you get great service, you go to the passport office. I got mine in less than 2 days. If TCS can do it, why does CDAC have to do it? Right?
I agree, but I'm not trying to make it a blanket point in terms of public versus private in that sense. Of course, ISRO, if they have developed something, they're welcome to go to the private sector. But in terms of how the government is trying to fund these things, in terms of on the supply side, that is, how do I collect these funds? We are spending less than 0.5% of our GDP on research.
But see, that it depends. See, I agree we're not spending. That I will agree with you, right? Okay. But the question is where that money comes from, who should spend it? I think it has to be decided on the basis of sectoral specificity, rather than our sort of pontificating, like, this is how it should be for vaccines to space to, developing the next generation of automobiles. I don't think it necessarily works that way, because the nature, to use your term customer, it also varies.
Yeah. Harsha, I'm going to stop you now for a sec. Because we have coming to a close. One of the things that struck me in your talk is this hybrid organization, clearly. The question is, how do you mobilize that organization in a local sense? And NGOs can do it, but they themselves cannot put together this coalition either. There has to be some mechanisms that are supportive of such enterprises, if you want to call it. So what is your impression? Is this some learning is taking place through these little exercises that it could generalize in terms of certain amount of support and governance procedures?
It's a good question. I mean, the thing is, where is the trigger? That's in a sense what you're asking, right? For this domain to kick in. I think, really speaking, there is no, once again, if this, for example, the state sees a problem with, delivering education to schools, the state then must actually invite the public sector, the private sector and NGOs who've been working with these things to actually come and help out and take a share. You have many companies now that are reaching out to NGOs and to the state for saying, come and help us. We'll sort of, let's walk this journey together. And also some NGOs are reaching out because they're taking advantage. And I think one thing that is very important here to say is, I think, which I find, which I'm fairly supportive of, although it is subject to some misuse, is the whole, the changes that were brought about to the Companies Act of 2013, which allowed for corporate social, which required corporate social responsibility spending, right? The only country in the world to do that. And that has, been somewhat effective in the sense forced companies to think of these things in areas beyond marketing their own products, right? And to get them to, and force them to think about, how can I know what is corporate social responsibility? Whom do I work with? What is this notion of a triple bottom line? Other than making sure that my balance sheet is in the black, this whole notion of, so there is a lot of whitewashing and greenwashing, all that goes on. There's no two ways about that. But nevertheless, this is not something that is like, what shall I say, this is widespread and rampant, but we've seen enough examples of this where the leadership has come from all three sectors, where they see, where they're able to point out to the acuteness of the problem. See, that is what is very critical. See, if I want to partner you, Sab, I must come and say, hey, listen, this is a compelling problem. You don't have what it takes to address it. I don't have what it takes to address it. But between the two of us, we can do something, because we all have our own set of incentives. See, the incentives are different, but they align at some point. Right? For the firm, it creates markets. For NGOs, it addresses the needs of the local community. For the state, it provides a means of taking a solution and potentially scaling it maybe across the district or the state.
Well, in some sense, if you go back to the regulated power monopolies in the US was doing exactly that, right? The monopolies were regulated by the PUC. They had regular increments of 5%. As long as they kept increasing the asset, they kept distributing power to the lowest person. So that created all the different incentives. And a lot of the old people in that generation bought stocks in these because they were assured of the return forever. And this was
but there's one difference. But there's one difference up. You didn't have the voluntary sector. So that was a relation between, particular relationship between state and capital. You did not have, and the problems are well defined. That is the key thing. Every household has to be supplied with so many, kilowatt hours at a particular price. Now, if I'm trying to cure certain, TB and those kinds of issues where where you have only certain aspects of the solution clearly defined, then it acquires or starts to acquire this character of wickedness, which is when you need this hybrid domain. It doesn't mean it will work everywhere. So where is it is the problems are undefined, where the goalposts keep shifting. Those are the situations where this is most compelling. If I know exactly what it is that I want to do, companies will go in and make their money.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, I think it is very contextual. That is the whole point of this, right? It is not droppable by helicopter or any of those kind of approaches will not work.
But when I say contextual, again, I'd be very, it is contextual, but what we're trying to do here is to theorize about a broader, if you're having these wicked problems, what is the nature, the institutional structure that you can think about as a possible solution? Then when it has to apply is contextual, but the analytical framing of institutional solution is more generic and broad-based.
Because it also addresses a notion of global and local in a different way. Okay? It's an interaction between the global and local. What is to be solved globally and what can be solved locally? How do you balance these two structures in terms of development?
Right.
Anyway, thank you very much for the lecture. I will stop recording and hopefully soon we'll have all these recordings up and have a good evening.
Yes. Thanks everybody for making time this evening. Good to see everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.